Just a reminder to you that today is the third Sunday, so there'll be an extended homily, question-answer discussion. And the readings are fairly dense today. If you notice what Alfred read for us and what I'm going to read from the Gospel of Mary, they're pretty densely packed. And to make matters worse, the homily is going to be really densely packed. Yeah. So I'm hoping that in the question-answer discussion period we can kind of tease it asunder a little bit and make it less kind of incomprehensible. That's the hope, at least. Yeah. It's from the Gospel of Mary, and this was a document which was discovered in just 1895 in a monk's grave in Egypt. Had been lost for 1,500 years, and there are patches of it missing. So there are actually 6 pages missing just before we pick up the dialogue, and it's a dialogue between the resurrected Jesus and somebody who's questioning him. And so we don't know who the questioner is at this stage. So here's how it goes. Will matter then be utterly destroyed or not? The Saviour replied, every nature, every modelled form, every creature exists in and with each other. They will dissolve again into their own proper root. For the nature of matter is dissolved into what belongs to its nature. Anybody with 2 ears capable of hearing should listen. Then Peter said to him, you have been expounding every topic to us. Tell us one further thing. What is the sin of the world? The Saviour replied, there is no such thing as sin. Rather, you yourselves are what produces sin, when you act according to the nature of adultery, which is called sin. For this reason, the good came among you, approaching what belongs to every nature. Then he continued, he said, this is why you get sick and die, for you love that which deceives you. Anybody with a mind should use it to think. A word inspired by God, I hope. In 1884, an English school teacher by the name of Edwin Abbott wrote a satirical novella which was called Flatland, a romance with many dimensions. And it was meant to be a critique of Victorian hierarchical society. But in actual fact, much later, was seen for what it really is. It's a brilliant mathematical and scientific thesis. And basically, the story behind it is this. He said, imagine a world which is flat. It's a two-dimensional world. It's like everything exists like on a plane, like a sheet of paper. So everybody that lives in this world, Flatland, is a two-dimensional creature. They have length and breadth, but they have no depth or height. So everything is two-dimensional. And imagine one day a three-dimensional object begins to approach this page, this flat page. A sphere is approaching it. And it begins to intersect with the sheet of paper. But because these guys live in Flatland, they can't see up and they can't see down. They can only see on the plane. So how would they experience this phenomenon? If this ball intersects with the sheet of paper, the first thing they'll notice is a dot. And the dot will begin to expand. If it's a hollow sphere, it'll expand into a ring. If it's a solid sphere, it'll expand into a full solid circle. But they're watching it and they're backing away from it because this dot is expanding and they're beginning to run away from the perimeter. And at some stage, it gets wider and wider and wider until it reaches the midpoint of the sphere, and then it starts to diminish again. And now they're following it back, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it goes out. And that's the only way they can experience it. They can't experience a third dimension. All they can see, is a two-dimensional object that starts as a dot and starts increasing, and then gets smaller and smaller and smaller. He used it as a satire on the society of the time. But subsequently, it became a very interesting look at the notion of reality. How do we experience reality? And that's what I'm going to try to wrestle with today. And I apologize ahead of time for kind of the density of the topic and the way I need to kind of, wrestle with it. But hopefully during the discussion period, we can kind of tease it asunder into more kind of manageable bites. And what I'm basically going to try to do is I'm going to make 3 points. I will talk about reality according to our senses. And then secondly, reality according to our minds. And then thirdly, reality according to our imaginations. Because they're very, very different realities being delivered to us by all three modalities. So let me start with reality that's delivered to us by the senses. The senses are really, really, really kind of shut down. They're very, very kind of, they're not very, very effective in looking at our knowledge of reality. So I want you to imagine the following thing. You've seen it every time. You live on a flat world. Basically, everybody thinks the world is flat. Not in the sense that we don't know it's a circle, but your experience of the world, sensorially, is that it's flat. I mean, there are mountains and there are crevices and stuff like that, but no matter how far you walk, you're not going to kind of feel that you're walking over the edge anywhere. So your experience of the world is that it's basically flat, with a few mountains and crevices and stuff, but it's basically flat. And your experience of the world, as delivered by your senses, is that the sun rises. And the truth, of course, is the sun doesn't rise at all. And in actual fact, you're not seeing even what appears to be the sun rising or the sun setting. You never actually see it, because the sun is 93 million miles away from us, and light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So it takes the light from the sun 8 minutes to reach Earth. And so the sunset that you're watching happened 8 minutes before it went down. And the sunrise is the same. So you never actually see what is. You look out into outer space, and there are stars out there which are millions of light years away from us, which means what you're looking at actually happened millions of years ago. You're not watching the star right now. The star could be long since gone. You'd have no idea, because it will take it millions of years for the light from that star as it once existed to reach you now. So you're never seeing, your senses are never delivering reality to you. And you think you live in a world, which is basically unmoving. We don't get a sense that it's spinning around, otherwise we'd feel dizzy. Nobody feels dizzy because we don't have a sense that the world is actually spinning, and we don't have the sense that it's moving through space, which it is. So our senses constantly give us a model of reality which is not true. They don't either deliver space correctly or time correctly to us. I want you to imagine the following thing. People decorate their houses at Christmas. So imagine you're walking up to a house in the distance, and there's a row of lights running along the roof of the house. And the Christmas lights. And it's arranged in such a way that the first light goes on and then goes off, and then the second light comes on and goes off, and the third light comes on and goes off. As you're watching it from a distance, it looks like there's a single light running along the roof, particularly if the time interval between one light going off and the other light coming on is very, very short. It looks like there's a single light running along the roof. And of course, that's not happening at all. What's happening is that one light is coming on and going off, the second light is coming on and going off in a slightly different physical position, the third light is coming on and going off, but the eye is going to deceive you. The eye is going to create the impression that there's a single light running along the rooftop. Now, that's exactly what happens when you look at your TV screen. Your TV screen, so that would be a one-dimensional kind of an illusion. The illusion that a single light is running along a line. Now, every time you look at a computer screen or you look at your TV set, there's a two-dimensional illusion, because your screen is composed of pixels, and there are gaps between the pixels. And the picture that you're actually watching and the motion that's taking place on the screen actually isn't happening. There's nothing moving across the screen. There are pixels being activated and deactivated, creating the impression that there's movement happening across the screen, but there isn't. It's not moving. There's nothing moving on your screen. So it's a total illusion in two dimensions. Now extrapolate from that, and you come into the world around you. What if we're living in a three-dimensional pixelated world? What if this world that we experience now is just, you extrapolate from the one dimension of the lights along a roof to the two dimension of a computer screen to reality, which is just simply a three-dimensional illusion with pixels in three dimensions coming into existence and coming out of existence. How would you know the difference? You wouldn't be aware of it. So there's the illusion that we live in this fabric of time-space, which is a continuum. It's not a continuum. We're constantly being fooled. It takes a snail 3 seconds to process a visual phenomenon. So if there's a snail walking along the back of this seat, and I take this bottle, and I put the bottle in front of the snail, and I leave it there for 2.5 seconds, and then I take it away. As far as the snail is concerned, there never was a bottle there, because his brain takes 3 seconds to process visually. If I take a human being, it takes a human being 1/24th of a second to process visually. So I put this bottle in front of George, and then I snap it away. In 1/25th of a second, George never saw the bottle. And so what our senses deliver to us, is not reality. It's some kind of an approximation. Who owns the bottle? Thank you. Can you see it? Okay, good. It's a total illusion. So the reality as delivered by our senses is not reality. Now, the Bible is a version of what people thought they saw or what they thought they sensed. And so when you read through the Bible, you have this story of what they saw, and what they saw very, very definitely was not what was there. You take the kind of Chinese version of creation. There's a great story in Chinese literature about an emperor who brought in his wisest advisor, and he wanted to know about, what's supporting the world. And he said to his wise man, "What is the world standing on?" And the wise man said to him, "Oh, it's standing on the back of a great lion." And the king said, "Wow, that's good. Lions are strong. That's good. But what's the lion standing on?" "Oh, the lion is standing on the back of a tremendous tiger." "Good. Tigers are good. Well, what's the tiger standing on?" "The tiger is standing on the back of a great big elephant, really strong elephant." And the emperor said, "Wow, fabulous, great. And what's the elephant standing on?" "The elephant is standing on the back of a huge, ancient turtle." And the emperor says, "Okay. And what's the turtle standing on?" "Oh, from there on down, it's turtles all the way." Now, in some senses, that's the Bible story as well. When you read through the scriptures, the model of reality delivered by their senses somehow is this, that the cosmos was like an upturned bowl. Imagine an upturned bowl, a semi-sphere. And for some reason, it's supported on pillars. Now, I have no idea what the pillars are resting on. The Bible never gets into that. But it's supported on pillars. This bowl turned upside down, supported on pillars. And there's dry land and there's water. And above this dome are sluice gates that God opens occasionally and lets rain down. And then he pokes holes in it and the light comes through, and there are the stars we see. That's the cosmology of the Old Testament. So that's what their eyes appear to deliver to them. So we can't trust our senses to deliver reality to us. Our senses are great. You look at at a sunset, or you appreciate, the taste of rum raisin ice cream, or you hear a piece of Mozart or whatever. The senses deliver some really great stuff to us. But none of it is real. None of it is ultimate reality. It's not what's out there. It's being created someplace else. So that's the first piece of bad news. It is okay, good. I like that attitude. Good. So the second point then is reality as delivered by our mind. So what happens when we begin to kind of think about what our senses are saying to us and see if there's someplace else we can go with it. Now here's the bad news when you depend on your mind. To the best of our knowledge, 95% of the universe is either dark matter or dark energy. So science can say absolutely nothing about it. We can say nothing about dark energy or dark matter. And it constitutes possibly 95 or 96% of our cosmos. Then we take the 5% or the 4% that's left, and we begin to try to look at it through the electromagnetic spectrum. The problem, however, is that our sensorium and even our instrumentations are so limited that we can only really experience our kind of grok 1/70 trillionth of the electromagnetic spectrum. If you represented the electromagnetic spectrum as a line joining Los Angeles with New York, 3,000 miles, the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that we're aware of or visible to us would be the diameter of a dime. So now that's how much of reality the mind can deliver to us. To make matters worse, we're subject to what philosophy calls the myth of the given. And that's the belief that what our senses record for us is actually a representation of what's out there. And it is not. We have no idea what is out there. All we can say is, given the range of our senses, and given this little black box that we use as a processor up here, here's the models that we create for ourselves in there. But we have no idea whether it corresponds to what's outside or whether it doesn't correspond to what's outside. So, for instance, a dragonfly has 2,800 facets in each of its two eyes. So the visual impression of a dragonfly flying over a field of flowers is radically different from what you and I experience when we, walk through a field of flowers. Or you take a snake. A snake can see into the infrared range. So a snake's vision of reality, sensorially speaking, is very, very different from yours or mine. Or take a bat. A bat can hear up to 100,000 cycles per second. Human beings can hear up to about 10,000. So a bat can have an acoustical image of a rose, We can't even understand what an acoustical image of a rose might sound like. And so our sensory mechanisms then again operate on this tiny little slice of reality that our mind can grok with. And so to make matters worse then, the actual stuff that we can actually touch and taste and smell, matter, what we call matter, is composed of atoms. And atoms are 99.99999% empty space. So the apparently solid stuff we're dealing with actually mostly isn't there to begin with. Things get even worse. The shortest possible distance that can be measured, not because our instrumentation is lacking, but because of the nature of reality, the shortest possible distance is called the Planck length. And a Planck length is 1.6 multiplied by 10 to the power of minus 35 meters. It's a tiny, 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 tiny space. Nothing can be smaller than a Planck length. It can't be. Not just that we can't measure it, it can't be. It can't exist. So to go back to your screen again, you're watching a computer screen with a whole bunch of pixels. You get high definition by putting more pixels into the space. So the more pixels you have, the greater your definition. But you can't get any two pixels closer than a Planck length. So there's always going to be a gap. So there's going to be a spot. You can't see it using your eyes, but there are spots all over your screen in which no space exists. So there are gaps in space. Space is not this continuous thing. It's like it's mottled. There are holes all over space. It's not this continuous thing. And so your computer screen is full of holes. Now, if that's the case, why can't we walk through walls? And the reason we can't walk through walls is that the atomic structure of solid objects, the atoms are out of sync. Atoms, subatomic particles, come in and out of existence on a regular basis. So an atom that moves from A to B doesn't move through the distance between them. It jumps from A to B. It's a discontinuous leap. It's like the lights on top of your house. They are flashing on in sequence. The light is not moving, The light is coming on in bulb number one, and then going off, coming on in bulb number two, and then going off. So the light is not traveling along the top of your roof. It's coming into being and failing to exist. It's coming in and out of existence on a regular basis. And that's how the subatomic world works. It comes in and out of existence on a regular basis. But they're out of sync with each other. So as one atom is coming into being, the other one is going out of being. And so the reason I can't walk through this is that the atoms are not all synchronized. If we could synchronize them, I could walk through the walls. If I could somehow synchronize the atoms in my body and synchronize the atoms in this desk, I could walk straight through the whole length of it without any problem. And that's part of the genius or the mystery of resurrection, because we inhabit different kinds of bodies which are not subject to atomic structure, or in which we can align or create coherence among the atoms of the makeup. So there's a very famous picture. There was a famous typhoon, I know it was Kentucky or someplace like this, created this whirlwind in a farmyard. And when it was finished, there was a blade of straw, just a piece of straw, embedded in a steel girder. Have you ever seen that photograph? Literally embedded in a steel girder. How the hell does a straw, this pliable little thing, embed itself in a steel girder? Because for whatever strange coincidence, all of the atomic structure of the girder lined up and were coherent for a moment, and they were off. And the straw hit at that stage and embedded until it came online again, and then it stuck half in and half out. And so if we could learn how to control our atomic structure, there would be no problem about dematerializing, walking through this wall, and rematerializing at the other side. And that's what we read of in the resurrection appearances of Jesus. That somehow he had literally gained control of the atomic structure of this body that he resurrected and could dematerialize at one side of the wall, move through the wall and rematerialize at the other side of the wall. And so space is not this continuous fabric. To make matters worse, neither is time. Time is not this continuous thing either. The smallest possible measurable time, not just because we can't measure something smaller, but something smaller doesn't exist in time, is called a Planck time length. And a Planck time length is 10 to the power of minus 43 seconds. There's nothing shorter than that. There cannot be anything shorter than a Planck length of time, which is 10 to the power of minus 43. And so time itself isn't continuous. Time is not this continuous stream from past to present to future. It's filled with all of these gaps. And so when electrons come in and out of existence and they jump from A to B, it's because there is no space between A and B, and there's no time between A and B. Time and space do not exist in that model. So now we got really big problems. So we live in a universe, according to our minds, which is 95% unknowable because it's dark matter, dark energy. And to make matters worse, our senses can only deliver 1/70 trillionth of the electromagnetic spectrum. And that electromagnetic spectrum is subject to the myth of the given, that we think that what we see corresponds to what's outside there. And then the stuff that we can actually contend with is broken down into atoms, which are 99.999% empty space, and their subcomponents come in and out of existence in a discontinuous, quantized fashion. And then you try to make sense of all of that. That's what happens when you use your mind to try to deliver reality. So my third point then is this. What happens when we engage our imaginations to try to create models of reality for us? Now, I've defined for you many, many times, imagination is not the faculty that allows us to make up stuff which is not real. That's fantasy. Imagination is that faculty that allows us to volitionally change our state of consciousness, to surf interdimensionally, to encounter entities and energies in these other dimensions, to dialogue with them, learn from them, come back into this state of consciousness and cross-fertilize our teaching. So that's what I mean by imagination. So what happens when we begin to employ our imaginations then, along with our senses and along with our mind? So you begin to look at some of the ancient traditions. When they engaged imagination in the sense in which I'm employing the word, what did they come up with? And a lot of them came up with similar kinds of notions. So Hinduism came up with the notion that all of manifestation originated through sound. And the sound of creation is the syllable Om. They sometimes call it the dial tone of the universe. So according to Hinduism, all of manifestation came into being through sound. John's Gospel is in agreement with that. In the great prologue to John's Gospel, there's the famous statement, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh." It manifested. Now, the phrase "in the beginning" is actually slightly inaccurate, because there was no time in the beginning. Time came after the beginning, so the sound happened before there was time. So therefore the sound happened not in the beginning, but before the beginning. So the sound actually created a beginning in which time was called into being and space was called into being. And so in John's Gospel, sound is the great creative agent. The very same thing you find in Aboriginal Australia. According to the Aboriginal mythology, the physical world was sung into being by the music of the ancestors. So every mountain and every stream had its own particular music, its own particular song. And you would never dare to climb a mountain or to forge a stream until you knew the music or the song of the stream or the mountain. You couldn't just kind of blunder in, any which way. You had to reverence it, know what the music of it was, and then move into it. So all these great traditions, the Hindu tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Aboriginal tradition, all say that the first thing was sound, that sound is the great agent of creation. And I believe the same thing is true. Now, part of the difficulty is that once creation begins, we're stuck with some level of duality. And this was the reading that Alfred did for us this morning, where he says, there can't be light without dark, there can't be up without down, there can't be male without female, there can't be inside without outside, But these are illusions. So he's saying, there is no such thing as up or down, there's no such thing as death or life, there's no such thing as good or bad. And so this is really shocking when you hear there's no such thing as good or bad. So what does this mean? So duality is this extraordinary dance between the immanence of God, the manifest aspect of the divine, and the transcendent aspect of the divine. It's this dance between the unmanifest and the manifest, between the mystical and the mundane. And so duality is an experience all of us have. We distinguish between good and bad, between male and female, between up and down, between inside and outside. And we need to be able to learn to use that as a kind of way of, bootstrapping ourselves into enlightenment. It is only by encountering, in a sense, suffering that we can develop compassion. If there were no such thing as suffering, compassion would atrophy on the vine. And so in some senses, there's a purpose to duality. Duality is the invitation to bootstrap ourselves into enlightenment. So we have to work with duality. Without suffering, there would be no compassion. Without evil, in a sense, there would be no ability to develop free will or freedom. And so the ability to be a totally free person is predicated on there being evil. the ability to be a totally compassionate person is predicated on the need for some kind of suffering to be encountered. And so the job of duality, when we encounter duality, is to realize two things. It is to employ duality as a springboard toward enlightenment, but realize that duality itself is actually an illusion of our state of consciousness. It's because of our senses and because of the little minds that we have that we experience reality in this dualistic fashion. So if we're going to experience it, we may as well use it to our own benefit. Use it to become an enlightened being, but don't identify and think that that's actually the structure of reality. It is not. The structure of reality is unity, consciousness, is God as she exists on her own. And so here's my own kind of synthesis of all these ideas in a way. If I'm to build a house, there are three things necessary. The first thing is I need to have a blueprint, an idea of what the finished product is going to look like. The second thing is I need to assemble materials, whether it's wood or cement or glass or whatever it is. And the third thing is I need to have a workforce who can turn the materials, according to the blueprint, into an actual three-dimensional house that I can take occupancy of. Now, if you want to develop a self-aware cosmos, there are also three components that you need. And so in some senses, you're going to need a blueprint. The blueprint is sound, is Om, or is Logos, the Word of God, or the Aboriginal songs of the ancestor. And so the blueprint for all of creation is sound. The material for creation is light, because light, it is the densification of light that actually creates the experience of matter. And then finally, you need a workforce. And the workforce are incarnated souls. So to build a self-aware cosmos, you need sound, you need light, and you need souls volunteering for incarnation. And that's exactly, I think, what we find here. So sound exists at many, many different levels of density, and light exists at many, many different levels of density, and these two dance together. So if you get very, very subtle light dancing with very, very subtle sound, you get very exalted life forms, maybe angelic beings. If you get very, very dense levels of sound interacting with very dense levels of light, you get very kind of solid, grounded forms, maybe like rocks. And then every combination in between is going to give us life forms with particular kinds of facets. And we as human beings are someplace in the middle of this complex. We are this combination of some level of sound with some level of light, and we dance into a particular form. And every form that exists is a dance between these things, whether we're talking about a galaxy or a crocodile. Everything that exists, every form that exists is a dance between sound and between light. And so to make a conclusion before we start teasing this asunder, traditionally there were four great kinds of cartographers of reality, people who tried to map reality. And some of them were called philosophers, some of them were called theologians, some of them were called scientists, and some of them were called mystics. So there were basically four kinds of map makers traditionally. The philosophers who used the mind, the theologians who used revelation, the scientists who were using a particular methodology, and the mystics who were engaged with the soul knowledge. Years and years ago, I coined a word which I call mysticists, and it's my belief system that the future belongs to the mysticists. There has to be a merging of these four modalities, the philosophical modality, the theological, the scientific, and the mystical, in order to create a way of wrestling with our experiences, in order to create less inaccurate maps of reality. And if you're not confused enough now, I can confuse you some more. Let's open it up, guys. Patricia. Oh, yes, the mic. Patricia.
This may be just a very simple question, but how do they figure out that a Planck length and a Planck length of time is the smallest measurement?
Okay.
Who figures that out, and how do they do it?
Okay. So the guy who actually got a Nobel Prize for that is Max Planck. He was a famous German physicist. Okay, yeah. Do you want to say any more about that, Ron? Do you want to elucidate on that a bit?
No, that's something I'm unaware of, but I am aware of something else you referred to about dark matter. Dark matter isn't a theoretical thing. It was discovered by noticing gravitational effects, which couldn't be explained by visible things.
Yes.
And so in order to they could quantize how much stuff
was
there
necessary.
creating these gravitational effects. They couldn't see it with any other instrumentation or anything else, and they came up with this estimate, 94, 95%. But there actually is evidence of dark matter. It's not some theoretical.
Totally. And that's where I'm saying that when I move from, reality delivered by the senses to reality delivered by the mind, this is a reality delivered by the mind, that you have to try to accommodate the data by creating some kind of a theory that can make sense of it. So it's a kind of, so Max Planck was the guy who came up with that. It's called after him, the Planck length of space and the Planck length of time. Yeah. Sorry, the other Patricia, did you have your hand up? Yeah. And then Lee.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a big question that feels very practical.
Okay.
To ask you to apply this to a practical situation.
Okay.
So, just for fun.
Okay, just for fun.
Yeah. So, I have a friend
Okay.
whose child is on the Asperger's spectrum.
Okay.
And this creates all sorts of problems for living in the world of our senses. Without going into the problems, pretend you're the mother of this child. And can you apply these to how do we deal with a child who may not be able to have any kind of real functionality? For example, may never have a friend, and certainly may never have a husband or wife or whatever.
So
These things.
Sure, that's a great question, Patricia, and there are three things that come to mind when I hear that. And the first thing is, if I were the mother, I would hope to get to a position where I understand that the love I have for this child is coming from not just our social interactions or not just kind of the physicality of the two of us, but from some kind of a soul commitment. It's a contract between souls, and that this little child, no matter how autistic or where on the autistic or the Asperger's syndrome he is, that he's an eternal being, who never was born and never will die. The soul was never born and will never die. And so I would hope as the mother to operate out of that realization that for whatever the spacesuit looks like, and by spacesuit I mean not just the physicality of the child, but the mentality, the personality, the emotionality, that the spacesuit itself is not who the child is. And I'd want to relate, as soul to soul. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is it falls within the compass then of, why do kind of bad things happen? Why do we not live in a perfect world? And the reason we don't live in a perfect world is that we volunteered for a world in which there is imperfection. We volunteered to be part of a world in which, there would be difficulty and vicissitude, sickness, death, prejudice of various kinds, in order to try to develop our ability to love in all circumstances. It's like, imagine somebody who wants to be a really, really good marathon runner. And instead of just going out and pounding the pavement every morning, running 26.2 miles, he puts weights on his legs and he goes out into sand, soft sand, and he's running through sand. So he's specifically limited himself and he's dragging his feet through soft sand in which there's no traction. And he's doing that day after day after day. And then finally comes the day of the race and he takes off the weights and he's on a track. This guy is going to go like a wind. In some senses, that's why we incarnate on planet Earth. There are much easier places to incarnate. There are dimensions and planets where life is a lot easier than it is on planet Earth. The people who volunteer for planet Earth are people who are dedicated to significant growth spiritually. The problem is we fall asleep. We're not aware of the fact of who we really are and why we've really come. So that's the second thing I would say, that all of these circumstances, like the Asperger's syndrome, or somebody who has dies of a heart attack at 37 or whatever, or a little baby who's born dead or whatever, these are all circumstances that are part of the invitation of incarnation to learn how to love anyway, to learn resilience, to learn patience, to learn courage, to learn compassion, to learn all these things. That's the second thing I would say. And the third thing I would say is a kind of more kind of technical. That in some senses, my understanding of the Asperger's syndrome and autism of various kinds is that these kids very, very often are savants. They're geniuses in particular areas. It can be painting, it can be mathematics or whatever. And so there's the human brain somehow has had to shut itself down in order for an ego to emerge. The price of an ego is that we shut down all kinds of connections to the universe. In an autistic child or somebody on the Asperger's syndrome, there's less and less of that inhibition in the brain. And so the child is plugged in to the Akashic records or levels of reality, which the rest of us are not. But the price of that, disinhibition, is a loss of ego, and therefore a loss of the ability to form social attachments. So it's like, in some senses, it's the price that a child pays for having more access, to how the universe really works, and expressing that mathematically or musically. So they're the three kinds of things I would respond to. Sharon, and then Lee, and then Sharon. So Lee was first.
Lee first?
Lee first, yeah.
I think I can add a little bit to Patricia's question as to where the Planck constants came from.
Right. Greatly.
They started with the Planck's constant of length was the smallest subatomic particle they could detect.
Okay.
They got down to where the particle either was there or wasn't there. It wasn't spread out any.
Mm.
And then they took the speed of light, which is the fastest thing theoretically known. The Planck's time constant is the time it takes the speed of light to get across the distance of a subatomic particle.
Brilliant.
It's very small.
Very, very small. 10 to the power minus 43. Great. Thanks a million for that. Does that help, Patricia? Good. Good. Good.
It's mysteries all the way down.
Okay. Okay, good. Sharon.
I'm fascinated with these, with many of these gifted children, and which many people think are just broken, or they're really. We feel we're the normal ones, and yet, and it's so mysterious and hard to communicate with them, and yet there's a book called Children of Now and a follow-up evolution of Children of Now that is just amazing, because this woman who was autistic herself struggled, and through telepathic communication, these kids connected with her, and because they needed her help and compassion and understanding, so that they could function better in this world. And as you said, many of them are brilliant, and yet they may have hardly a thing functioning properly. And these two books are something that I think every parent, if you don't have a child, you know someone who does. And it helps us to appreciate what they're trying to teach us. I mean, they're coming with a big mission, and it's awesome. So I really highly recommend. And even if you don't have kids or know anyone, they are part of our world, and a very important part. Who don't, they're not about fixing, but coming to terms with how we can merge in some way.
That's brilliant, Sharon. Fabulous. There was a famous Indian guru one time, I think it may have been Ramana Maharshi perhaps, who said that all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the self. It's a tiny gap. It's like a Planck length gap between the ego and the self, but all human suffering happens there. And in some senses, an autistic child or somebody in the Asperger's syndrome, they're not as attached to the ego, as the rest of us are. So in some senses, they're kind of spared the exigencies of being driven by egoic greed or need or selfishness, although obviously they suffer in social relationships. But the two kind of benefits from it is that they're not as much ego-driven as the rest of us, and as well as that, they have much more access, because there are less filters between reality as it exists, whatever that is, and our construction of it through our mental processes. Yeah. Karen.
Just what you said makes me wonder if children who come in that way have already in previous lifetimes dealt with that gap.
Okay. That's
and so
interesting.
that they don't need it.
Okay. So did you hear Karen's question? She's wondering if children who come in, autistic kids who come in, or Asperger's, if they've already in previous incarnations dealt with that gap, and so they don't need to wrestle with that one anymore. It's very, very possible, because I'm convinced that all of us on the planet are here by contract. We make these, what I've called preconception contracts, at various levels. There's a preconception contract between you and your soulmate. There's a preconception contract between you and your family. There's a preconception contract between you and your culture. There's a preconception contract between you and your species. And there's a preconception contract between all the denizens of planet Earth. And so we all come in, playing roles in this, and part of the thing is that every one of us is teaching the others and learning from the others. So there's something that we're learning from these kids. It's not just about medical procedures to kind of feed them pharmaceuticals that'll make them normal. It is to try to learn what is the gift they bring to us, what's the invitation of their existence. And each one of us is bringing a gift, and learning. We're all students and teachers at the same time. Susie.
Are there ways or techniques for us to understand or to sense, like the music or the sound of our environment, our day-to-day, environment?
Yeah, brilliant. That's a great question. So Susan's question is there a way for us to kind of sense the music of our environment? If indeed music is kind of the organizing, orchestrating principle of incarnation or kind of manifestation itself, is there some way of being in touch with that? We can touch it in two ways, basically. We can touch it in its core essential essence, or we can touch it in its manifestations. And so everywhere you see beauty around you, not just acoustically, but when you see beauty visually, or you experience beauty in a relationship, or you experience beauty in a mathematical formulation, wherever you're experiencing beauty, you're experiencing a manifestation of that essential music. And then the second way, obviously, is going so deeply into the self that you encounter the core out of which the spacesuit emerged. And that's the object of all meditation. Meditation of all schools, whatever school of meditation you come from, has one objective. It is the disidentification with ego. And when you strip away the ego, the silence between the sounds is the real music. So the real music, is not so much an acoustical phenomenon as the sound of the silence of manifestation. So when you really, really dig deeply into meditation and you hold yourself in the gap between the thoughts, between the sensations, between the memories, between the imaginings, you're touching into that. And in some senses, it is soundless, a wordless music. Yeah. Margaret, did you have your hand up?
Yes,
Good. Good.
I came to church today and I brought something, and I think you addressed it, but I didn't get everything you said.
Sure. Can you repeat that for the microphone? Yeah.
Use it?
Repeat that for the microphone so we can
Okay,
hear it.
I came to church today with something that I really wanted to ask all of you, Sean in particular. About 4 months ago, no, 4 weeks, I don't know, sometime in my life, in the last recent, I read a New Yorker article where they're giving LSD to terminal patients so that they can have the mind-altering experience of the drug, and they give it to the terminal patient a month or 6 weeks before maybe that they're going to live that long. And then the person has an altered experience of reality. One of these planes perhaps are what you said today are happening. Things get turned upside down and inside out, and the person comes out of this and they have an awakening.
Yeah.
And then they are
Yes.
less anxious and more at peace.
Okay, that's brilliant. So make a response to that. I mean, basically, we're called upon to be cosmonauts, not in the sense of exploring the physical universe in which we find ourselves, but exploring the multidimensional reality that creation consists of. And there are many, many ways of surfing those dimensions. Fasting does it, prayer does it, meditation does it, pain sometimes does it, hallucinogenics do it. So there are many ways that we can surf the dimensions. The question is, so what I know about the hallucinogenic methodology of accessing different states of consciousness is that there are 4 very important characteristics, and they're called the 4 S's. It's setting, the environment in which you partake in this. The second one is mindset. So if it's done as a kind of a spiritual exercise, and if this, substance is regarded as a sacrament, as it is, for instance, let's say in South America with ayahuasca, it's a sacrament for these people, or with peyote for the Native American Indian population. So if the mindset is a mindset of using this sacramentally, that's the second component. The third is called the substance itself. What substance are you ingesting? They all have different kinds of properties. And the fourth one is the sitter. You have to be with some kind of a mentor or a guide, somebody who knows the terrain and is able to kind of guide you through the experiences you're subsequently going to have. Now, if all those four, are in alignment, then what I've read of this literature is that there's been extraordinary scientific evidence before many of these substances were banned. So one of my favorite authors actually is a man called Stan Grof. Stan Grof was a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist, who was experimenting with LSD way back in the 50s before it was made illegal in his laboratories in Czechoslovakia, and then when he came to this country as well. Then it was outlawed sometime, I think, in the 60s. But in that period, they were having extraordinary benefits with psychiatric populations and with the addicted populations, and then subsequently with people who were really scared of dying. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been government grants allowing specific researchers to engage with some hallucinogenic drugs. There was a guy down in the University of New Mexico who experimented with DMT in a controlled hospital setting. And the object of the exercise was to find out what is the cartography of the dimensions in which people access, when they use particular kinds of substances or they use particular kinds of prayer methodologies. And again and again and again, what they're finding is that if they're used sacramentally in controlled ways under the guidance of a real mentor figure, they can have extraordinary psychological benefits and spiritual benefits. And there's a lot of literature specifically on working with the dying and erasing their fear of death. Because apart from the physical discomfort of dying in some circumstances, the main discomfort among the dying is the fear of the unknown. Now, if you can have an experience, an interdimensional experience, and come back for it, like people, for instance, who have near-death experiences, then it erases the fear of death. And the literature suggests that these people now embrace the dying process in a totally different fashion. Yeah. Carmencita.
I was still thinking about the Planck length.
Yes, okay.
Because that really
Good.
impressed me.
Okay.
And I think probably it is true right now. Because I have a dictionary which is over 100 years old.
Yeah.
And when you look the word atom, it says indivisible particle.
Yes. I mean, that's so true. The scientific method is just a story. It's the best fit we have to the data. And so at every stage, there was a best fit to the data. The Bible story of Genesis was the best fit to the data. The story of the Aborigines was the best fit to the data. Irish mythology was the best fit to the data. The scientific method is just the best fit to the data. It's a methodology that delivers a kind of models or principles that are the best fit to the data. And they're ludicrously inadequate. All we can hope to do in any methodology is to provide slightly less inaccurate maps of reality. We're never going to have a map of reality, ever, this side of the grave. And so all we can hope for is try to clear up the most egregious mistakes, the more egregious mistakes we've made. And of course, you had the notion that the atom was the indivisible, and then we break it up into, subcomponents. There's electrons and neutrons and protons, and then they broke up into quarks, and then the quarks of different kinds, spin and charm and up and down, and that's where we are right now. And in 10 years' time, that'll be ludicrous. We think now that maybe M theory, is the greatest kind of unified, explanation for the universe. In 20 years' time, we'll be laughing at that, at how pathetically inadequate it was. Yeah. So it's a work in progress. Charlie.
So I need you to help me add this up.
Okay.
If we look at the concept, and back to the Planck theory, if you look at the concept of infinity, you can always add one more unit, and you get to an infinite amount. If we have subatomic particles, couldn't you continue to use your imagination to cut that particle in half or divide it in half? Maybe you couldn't acknowledge it or measure it, but if we have infinity on one edge, how come we couldn't have divisible on the other?
Okay. Part of the problem is that infinity is a concept which is it's a made-up concept. totally made up. That for a long period of time, it didn't exist in mathematics. And for a long period of time, zero didn't exist in mathematics. It was the Hindus that created the mathematical concept of zero. We think it's obvious. You can't have a counting system without a zero. Well, we did. For a long time, mathematics operated without a zero. Now, with infinity, infinity is a totally anomalous characteristic because there are different kinds of infinity. There's countable infinity and there's uncountable infinity. So, for instance, the positive integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, is an infinite sequence of numbers. But it's countable. You can keep counting. You take the rational numbers, fractions, and that's an uncountable infinity. So you take any two fractions, no matter how close they are. Let's say take 1 over 115 and 1 over 116. Very, very close. There's an infinite uncountable number of other rational numbers in between those. And if you take any two inside the middle of that and separate them, there's an infinite number of uncountable rational numbers in there. So infinity as a concept, in some senses, like a grab all. It has scientific applicability, like many other things which are made up. So, for instance, like, let's say, a system like imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers were invented by an Italian mathematician, I believe sometime in the 1800s, and people laughed him out of court. How can you have an imaginary number? He said, well, in ordinary mathematics, when you multiply a number by itself, it's always positive, no matter what the number is. If you multiply 3 by 3, you get plus 9. If you multiply minus 5 by minus 5, you get plus 25. So if you multiply anything by itself, whether it's positive or negative, the result has to be positive. This guy said, why? Why can't it be negative? So I'm going to invent one. I'm going to call it the square root of minus 1. And if you multiply the square root of minus 1 by the square root of minus 1, you get minus 1. And he called it iota, imaginary number. And it's the basis of all complex mathematics and interstellar space travel. It has extraordinary practical application, although it's a totally made-up entity. I'll give you another example. The equator. The equator doesn't exist. And I lived on it. I know exactly, because I crossed over it literally several times every day. There's no bump in the road. There's no such thing as an equator. But the concept of an equator and a longitude and latitude grid allows us tremendous ability to practically figure out where we are on the face of the planet. So things don't have to be real before they can be practical. And so the concept of infinity is a totally made-up concept. It didn't exist in mathematics for a long period of time, and it is totally anomalous because there's no way to put your finger on it. So, for instance, if you take any number, any rational number, and divide it by infinity, you get 0. Doesn't matter how big the number is. If you divide any rational number, 1 over infinity is 0. 5,716 divided by infinity is 0 as well. So is 0 equal to 0? Are all zeros equal? They're not. Are all infinities equal? They're not. And so you're wrestling with two totally made-up concepts that you can't put your finger on. And then you're trying to make sense of combining them. So that's part of the problem. Yeah. So it's all made up, guys. Lorraine. Say that again into the mic.
I'm trying to process what you said earlier, and it's kind of a synchronicity. I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who's a physicist, and he was telling me that this one physicist came up with a model of reality where there's only one atom.
Okay, yes.
Did you ever hear of that? I
Yeah.
think it was in the 1800s, and
Okay.
I think his last name might have started with an F. I don't remember.
Okay.
It's just kind of bizarre.
Okay. So you're really dealing with data that are being processed through senses, either directly or through instrumentation, and they're going through this tiny little laptop we carry between our ears, while we're dealing with an infinitely complex, physical cosmos, let alone the multidimensional aspects of the cosmos. And so anything we attempt to come up with will literally just be another effort at kind of accommodating the data with as little, mistakes as possible. But they're always going to be full of mistakes. This side of the grave, or this side of of incarnation, there is no way of comprehending with our tiny little minds what is basically an ineffable experience. Yeah. You want to hear a joke? Heisenberg was driving and he bought a new sports car, and he's driving through the countryside and he's stopped by a cop, and the cop says to him, "Do you know what speed you were doing?" And he says, "No, but I know where I am." Okay.
I have nothing to say.
Say that. Who said that?
Shade of red. God,
Who said that, Georgie?
you turn red after you tell a joke.
Okay. Okay. Because that's deep. Yeah, but you have to know quantum mechanics to get it.
I do have a, well, this is sort of running around. There's a lot of anxiety produced by this division, dividing things into this, and looking at gaps. And I think, that's a lot of ego. And I was writing notes here because as an artist, I was just working with my daughter last night about negative space, how important that is. And I was thinking about, well, negative space, because it defines everything else.
Absolutely.
So there are things in reality, but they're defined by something that's not
there.
real.
Absolutely.
Unless it's real,
Yes.
because that's, that's what you see. Once you've defined the negative space, all of a sudden that's what you see.
Absolutely.
This part of the ocean instead of these two buildings or whatever.
It's hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the gaps, I just think of the gaps are where God is.
Brilliant. It's brilliant, totally. And that's the whole purpose of duality. That's the importance of embracing duality as a way of bootstrapping to God. So let me give you three kind of simple examples of the places in which what is not there is more important than what is there. If you take that door back there, the most important part of that door is the part that's not there. Otherwise we couldn't get out. The most important part of a cup is the part that's not there. The space inside that you put the water or the wine or whatever into. It's the most important part. There's a great American physicist called Bernard Heisch, who has a theory of creation where he talks about creation by subtraction. And he says it is by limiting infinite possibilities that we create finite realities. And the example I use is, if we take, if that's a movie theater, this is a movie theater, and we've got a light up at the back, and we're beaming the white light onto the screen. And there's just white light. There's nothing distinguishable in white light. But when we run a movie by it, and we selectively occlude parts of the white light, we create the illusion of reality. Now you see a figure riding across the stage on a horse. What you're actually looking at is the part that's been blocked out. So it's the part that's not there. It's been surrounded by the white light, just like your foreground, background, negative space, whatever. So in order to wrestle with reality, we wrestle mainly with the stuff that's actually not there. And we take what's not there to be the reality. And we ignore the fact that what's really there, underlying all of it, is the white light. And the white light is God or soul. But until we have the ability to kind of embrace the light without the need for the slideshow, we're going to be stuck in duality and stuck in physicality. And where we are, embrace it and use it to develop compassion, and free will and freedom. We take one last question and we'll call it a day.
This is just a really quick comment on what Margaret just said. This notion of the negative space, once your your sight has shifted to that negative space, you can't not see it.
Yes, totally, absolutely. Once you become aware of it, you can't become unaware of it subsequently. Brilliant. So guys, if I've really confused everybody, I've accomplished my mission.